I'm writing this down because nobody at Brookside Cemetery will talk to me anymore, and because I need someone to know what happened before I decide what to do next. My name is Hank Doherty, and for 25 years I've operated heavy machinery at this graveyard. Backhoes mostly, sometimes the vault lowering device. I've dug graves in frozen January ground, and in August heat so thick you can taste the clay dust. I've worked through rainstorms that turn fresh plots into swimming pools. I've seen caskets crack, heard settling noises that would make your skin crawl, and once watched a coffin shift during lowering because someone didn't secure the straps properly. None of that prepared me for Evelyn Kowalski. The exhumation order came through on a Tuesday in March. Standard relocation. The family wanted to move Evelyn from the old Catholic section to the new multi-faith garden where her husband had been buried the previous fall. I'd done maybe 40 exhumations in my career, so I knew the drill. Brad Seymour, our operations manager, handed me the paperwork in his office that morning around 7:30. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and Brad had that tired look he always gets when dealing with family transfers. He told me the vault company's records showed a total weight of 312 pounds, casket, body, and concrete vault lid combined. Everything by the book. We started the dig at 9. The day was overcast, that flat gray light that makes everything look washed out. My crew, two younger guys named Tom and Eddie, had already marked the plot and moved the flowers. I brought the backhoe around and began the careful work of removing soil. You don't just dig straight down for an exhumation. You excavate around the vault, expose the lid, then use chains and the hoist to lift it. The whole process takes about 3 hours if the ground cooperates. That morning, the soil was damp but workable, and we hit the vault lid by 11. That's when Father Anthony Ricci showed up. I'd seen him around over the years, late 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of priest who looks like he's carrying the weight of every confession he's ever heard. He stood at the edge of the plot with his hands in his coat pockets, watching us work. I didn't think much of it at first. Clergy sometimes attend exhumations, especially for families they knew well, but he seemed agitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot. When I climbed out of the excavation to grab a bottle of water, he asked me if everything looked normal. I told him it looked like every other vault I'd ever opened. He nodded but didn't leave. He just stood there staring down at the concrete lid like he was expecting it to crack open on its own. We hooked the chains at 11:40 and began the lift. The hydraulic hoist groaned the way it always does, and the vault lid rose smooth and steady. Tom and Eddie guided it to the side, and then we had the casket exposed. It was a mid-range bronze model, the kind with brushed pewter handles. The seal looked intact. No signs of water intrusion or degradation. I checked the weight reading on the hoist display, out of habit, 312 pounds, exactly what the record said. That detail matters. That detail is what keeps me up at night now. Nicole Kowalski arrived just as we were preparing to open the casket. She was Evelyn's daughter, 47, with her mother's dark hair and the kind of exhausted eyes that come from months of grief. Brad had called her because the family needed to confirm the identity before we could proceed with the transfer. It's required by state law. Nicole stood next to Father Ricci, clutching a photo of her mother. And I remember thinking how much I hated this part of the job, making families look at remains, even if it's just a formality. I unsealed the casket at 12:15. The latches released with a soft click, and I lifted the lid slowly, the way you always do, preparing myself for the smell and the sight of a body that's been underground for 5 years. But there was nothing. The casket was completely empty. The white satin lining was pristine. Not a stain or wrinkle or depression where a body should have been. No clothing, no jewelry, no sign that anyone had ever been placed inside. Just empty, perfect fabric that looked like it had been installed yesterday. I stood there with my hands on the lid, not understanding what I was seeing. Tom and Eddie crowded in behind me, and I heard Eddie whisper something I couldn't make out. Brad pushed forward, his face going pale, and that's when I felt it, the warmth. The interior of the casket was warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than it should have been, like someone had been breathing in there moments before. And the smell hit me then, sweet and floral, and completely wrong. Fresh lilacs. Not the chemical smell of embalming fluid or the musty scent of decay, but the clean, living smell of flowers in full bloom. Nicole made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and Father Richie grabbed her arm to steady her. Brad was already on his phone, calling someone, his voice tight and controlled. I just stood there, staring into that empty casket, trying to make sense of the numbers. 312 pounds. The hoist didn't lie. We'd lifted 312 pounds of casket and contents, but there were no contents, just warm satin and the smell of lilacs. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I was thinking about all the years I'd been doing this job and how wrong everything suddenly felt. They brought in Iris Tanaka 3 days later. She was a forensic archaeologist from the State University, mid-40s, with the kind of precise way of speaking that made you believe she'd never encountered a problem she couldn't explain. She spent 2 full days at the site, taking soil samples, examining the vault, documenting everything with cameras and measuring tools. I watched her work from a distance, hoping she'd find something that made sense, evidence of grave robbery, tunnel access, anything. But when Brad called me into his office on Friday afternoon, Iris was there with her laptop open, and the expression on her face told me everything I needed to know. The soil analysis showed no disturbance. She said, the vault had been sealed continuously since the original burial in October 2019. No access points, no breaches in the concrete, no tool marks or signs of tampering. The casket seal had been intact until I opened it. She'd reviewed the funeral home's video records. There was Evelyn Kowalski's body being placed in the casket, the lid being closed and sealed, the whole process documented in grainy security footage. The cemetery's burial logs confirmed everything. Date, time, location, all correct. But somehow, between burial and exhumation, Evelyn Kowalski had vanished from a sealed container inside a concrete vault 6 feet underground. Iris used the word impossible 4 times in that meeting. Brad kept asking about alternative explanations, his voice getting higher with each question. Iris just shook her head, and I noticed her hands were trembling slightly when she closed her laptop. Before she left, she pulled me aside in the hallway and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual beyond the empty casket. I told her about the warmth, about the smell of lilacs. She was quiet for a moment, then said something I'll never forget. The air temperature inside that casket was 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly body temperature. Then she left, and I haven't seen her since. Nicole stopped returning Brad's calls after that, but Father Richie came back to the cemetery one more time, about a week after the exhumation. I was doing maintenance work near the old Catholic section when I saw him standing at Evelyn's plot, which we'd filled back in. He didn't notice me at first, and I watched him stand there with his head bowed, lips moving like he was praying. When I approached, he turned quickly, almost startled, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen before. Fear, real, bone-deep fear. He told me that during Evelyn's funeral mass in 2019, he'd felt something in the church. A presence, he called it, not evil but wrong somehow, like the air pressure had changed. He dismissed it at the time as exhaustion or grief affecting his perception. But standing there by the refilled grave, he said he felt it again. That same wrongness, like something was watching us, waiting. I asked him what he thought happened. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, I think she left, Hank. I think something came for her, and she went willingly. Then he walked away, and I haven't seen him since either. Brad put me on administrative leave 2 weeks ago. They're calling it a paid suspension while they investigate irregularities in burial procedures. I know what that means. They think I did something wrong, that somehow I'm responsible for what happened. Maybe they think I'm crazy. Maybe I am. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt, and I know that the morning we opened that empty casket, Nicole Kowalski called me before I'd even told anyone what we'd found. She called at 6:30 in the morning, 3 hours before we started the exhumation, and said her mother's house, the house she'd been cleaning out, had filled with the smell of fresh lilacs overnight. She said she'd woken up to it, that it was so strong she could barely breathe. She wanted to know if that meant something. I told her I'd call her after the exhumation. I never did. I drive past Brookside Cemetery sometimes now, usually late at night when I can't sleep. The gates are locked, but I can see the plots from the road, rows of headstones stretching into the darkness. I find myself looking for Evelyn's grave, though I'm not sure what I'm expecting to see. Sometimes I think about the weight reading on that hoist, 312 pounds of nothing. Sometimes I think about Father Ricci's face, The way he looked when he said she went willingly. Mostly I think about that warmth, that impossible warmth, and wonder if something is still there in that plot, waiting in the dark. If you work at a cemetery, if you dig graves or maintain plots or do exhumations, I need you to understand something. When the weight is wrong, but the numbers are right, don't open the casket. Mark it down as complete and walk away. Don't question it, don't investigate it. Don't try to make sense of it, because once you see that empty space where someone should be, once you feel that warmth and smell those flowers, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you're next. You'll wonder what comes for us after we're buried, and whether the ground really holds what we put in it, and you'll never ever be able to look at a sealed casket the same way again.
Hello, YouTube family. Thanks for watching. Big love to our subscribers. You keep this channel alive. Only about 20% of viewers are subscribed, so if you enjoy the chills, hit that subscribe button. It's quick, it helps a ton, and it means more stories coming your way. See you in the next one, if you dare.
I need to tell you about something that happened 3 weeks ago at Fort Lyon Cemetery. Not because I expect you to believe me, but because I can't carry this alone anymore. My name is Wade Thornton, and I've been digging graves since I was 17 years old. My father did it, his father before him, and his father before that. 4 generations of Thorntons maintaining the same plots, operating the same equipment, following the same careful procedures that keep the dead at rest and the living at peace. I thought I understood the work. I thought I understood the boundary between life and death. I was wrong. The exhumation order came through on a Thursday morning in early October. Michael Shore, deceased 8 months prior, needed to be disinterred for a legal inquest. Something about the cause of death being disputed by the insurance company. I've done maybe 60 exhumations in my 26 years at Fort Lyon, so the process was routine: backhoe excavation, vault removal, casket extraction, identification, confirmation. My crew and I started the dig around 9 in the morning. It was one of those gray autumn days where the sky seems to sit right on top of you, and the air smells like wet leaves and cold earth. By 11, we had the vault exposed. Michael Shore had been buried in Section C, Plot 47, in a mid-grade steel casket with a concrete vault. Standard middle-class burial. The funeral home records showed he'd been embalmed properly, buried in a dark suit, no jewelry except his wedding band, which he'd never removed even after the divorce. His ex-wife Lydia had handled the arrangements, paid for everything, attended the service alone. That detail stuck with me later, how she'd done everything right by him even after they'd split, even after whatever had ended their marriage. We hoisted the vault lid at 11:30 and prepared to extract the casket. That's when I noticed the first thing that didn't sit right. The vault interior was damp, which isn't unusual given 8 months underground and the water table in this area. But there was a smell, faint but distinct, that wasn't the typical odor of decay or embalming chemicals. It was almost floral, like perfume mixed with something earthier. Fresh dirt, maybe. I mentioned it to Tommy, my assistant, but he just shrugged and said, "Old vaults always smell weird." I let it go. We got the casket up and onto the grass by noon. The forensic team was already there. Grant Holloway, a guy I'd worked with on a few other legal cases, and his assistant, whose name I can't remember. Grant's the kind of technician who treats every job like a crime scene, photographing everything, labeling samples, documenting chain of custody down to the minute. He walked around the casket twice before we opened it, taking pictures of the seal, checking for any signs of tampering. Everything looked normal. The seal was intact, no damage to the exterior, no indication anyone had accessed the casket since burial. I broke the seal at 12:15. The latches released with that distinctive click, and I lifted the lid slowly, preparing myself for what I'd see. 8 months underground does things to a body, even an embalmed one. But what stopped me cold wasn't the condition of Michael Shore's remains. It was everything else. There were 2 depressions in the white satin lining. Michael lay in the primary depression on the right side of the casket, exactly where he'd been placed during burial. But there was a second depression beside him. On the left, as if someone had lain there with him. The fabric was compressed in the unmistakable shape of a human body. Head, shoulders, torso, legs. The satin was darker there, stained with something I couldn't immediately identify. And woven through Michael's skeletal fingers wrapped around the bones of his left hand were strands of long auburn hair, not gray, not decomposed, but vibrant and intact, as if they'd been placed there yesterday. Tommy stepped back from the casket, his face pale. Grant moved in with his camera, photographing everything from multiple angles. I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, and that's when I noticed the footprints. They were on the interior of the casket, muddy impressions on the white satin, starting at the foot area and leading up to Michael's chest where they simply stopped. Small footprints, maybe a woman's size 7 or 8. The mud was still slightly damp. Grant spent 20 minutes photographing and documenting before he started taking samples. The hair first, carefully extracting it from Michael's finger bones with tweezers, sealing it in an evidence bag. Then he swabbed the stains on the satin, scraped samples of the mud from the footprints, took photographs of the second depression from every possible angle. He didn't say much while he worked, but I could see his jaw was tight, and his hands weren't quite steady. When he finally stepped back, he looked at me and said, "This is impossible. You know that, right?" I knew. The vault had shown no signs of entry. The casket seal had been intact. Nobody could have accessed Michael Shore's remains after burial without leaving obvious evidence of disturbance. Yet someone or something had been inside that casket with him, had lain beside him, had left hair and footprints and that faint smell of perfume and fresh earth. We called Lydia Shore that afternoon for formal identification. She arrived at the cemetery around 3, accompanied by Dr. Keith Hammond, who she introduced as her sleep specialist. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and that fragile quality people get when they're running on pure nerves. When she approached the casket, she went completely white. Not at the sight of Michael's remains. She barely glanced at those, but at the auburn hair that Grant held up in its evidence bag. "That's mine," she whispered. "That's my hair." Her hand went to her own hair, the same auburn color, and I watched her fingers tremble. Dr. Hammond put a hand on her shoulder, but she shook him off. "I've been sleepwalking," she said, her voice getting higher, "for months now. I wake up, and there's dirt under my fingernails, and I can't remember where I've been. Keith's been trying to help me, but nothing works. Nothing stops it." Dr. Hammond stepped forward then, his expression caught between professional skepticism and genuine concern. He explained that Lydia had been experiencing severe parasomnia episodes since late spring, around the time Michael had died. She'd wake in her backyard garden, in her car, once even on her front porch with no memory of how she'd gotten there. He tried medication, sleep studies, behavioral therapy, but the episodes continued. He'd been documenting everything, treating it as a standard, if severe case of sleepwalking. Until now, he'd been certain there was a rational neurological explanation. Grant called me 2 days later with the lab results. The hair was definitely Lydia's, DNA match confirmed. The mud from the footprints had been analyzed, and this is where everything went from disturbing to impossible. The soil composition didn't match the cemetery grounds. It matched Lydia's backyard garden, specifically the area around her wildflower beds. And speaking of wildflowers, Grant said there was one more thing he hadn't mentioned at the site. When he'd been photographing the casket interior, he'd found fresh flower petals scattered across Michael's remains. Small purple wildflowers, perfectly preserved, not decomposed at all, despite 8 months underground in a sealed casket. I drove to Lydia's house that evening. I don't know why, maybe because I needed to see the garden for myself, or maybe because I felt responsible somehow, like I should warn her about what we'd found. She lived in a small ranch house on the west side of town, and when I pulled up, I could see the garden in the back, visible from the street. Purple wildflowers were blooming there, thick and vibrant despite the autumn chill. The same flowers Grant had found in Michael's casket. Lydia answered the door, but wouldn't let me in. She stood in the doorway and I could see she'd been crying. I told her about the flowers, about the soil match, about how every piece of physical evidence pointed to something that shouldn't be possible. She just nodded, like she'd already known, like she'd been waiting for someone to confirm what she'd been afraid to admit. "I loved him," she said finally. "Even after everything, even after the divorce, I still loved him. Sometimes I dream I'm lying next to him, holding his hand like we used to. I wake up and my hand is closed around nothing, but I can still feel his fingers." She looked at me then, and her eyes were hollow. "Do you think some part of me goes to him at night? Do you think I'm visiting him while I sleep?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. But I told my mother about it the next day. Ruby Thornton, who's kept the cemetery books for 45 years and knows more about Fort Lyon's history than anyone living. She was quiet for a long time after I finished talking, And then she said something that's been eating at me ever since. She said there have been other cases over the years, incidents the family never reported, caskets opened during exhumations, showing signs of visitation, evidence of the living, somehow reaching the dead. She said the boundary isn't as solid as we'd like to believe, and that grief can be a powerful thing, powerful enough, maybe, to cross over. Grant filed his report as evidence of unknown origin and closed the case. The insurance company got whatever information they needed, and Michael Shore was reburied in a new casket in a different section of the cemetery. Dr. Hammond put Lydia on stronger medication, and according to what I've heard, the sleepwalking has stopped. But last week, I was doing routine maintenance in Section C and walked past Michael's new plot. There were fresh wildflowers on the grave, those same purple ones from Lydia's garden. Nobody had signed in at the cemetery office. Nobody had been recorded on the security cameras. The flowers were just there. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in spirits or supernatural visitations or any of that. I've spent my whole adult life working with the dead, and they've always been just that, dead, still, silent, gone. But I can't explain those footprints or that hair or those flowers. I can't explain how Lydia's garden soil ended up inside a sealed casket 8 months after burial. And I can't stop thinking about what my mother said, about grief being powerful enough to cross over, about the boundary between life and death being more permeable than we want to admit. If you've stayed with me this far, if you're still listening, I want you to think about something. Think about the people you've lost, the ones you still love even though they're gone. Think about where you are when you wake up, some mornings, about the dirt under your fingernails or the smell of earth in your hair that you can't quite explain. Maybe the dead aren't as far away as we tell ourselves. Maybe love doesn't stop at the grave. Maybe on certain nights we find our way back to the ones we've lost. I still work at Fort Lyon Cemetery. I still dig graves and perform exhumations and maintain the family tradition. But now, when I open a casket, I look for signs of visitation, disturbed satin, stray hairs, muddy footprints. You'd be surprised how often I find them. The question I can't answer is whether that should comfort us or terrify us. Whether knowing the dead aren't alone should make us feel better, or whether understanding that grief can make us cross impossible boundaries should scare us more than death itself. If you've experienced something similar, if you've woken with no memory and dirt on your hands, leave a comment, share your story. Maybe we're not as alone in this as we think. Maybe there are others who walk between worlds without knowing it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe. Because trust me, working in a cemetery for 26 years, I've got plenty more to tell. See you in the next one, if you dare. Or maybe I'll see you some night when you're not quite yourself. When grief pulls you somewhere you can't consciously go. Either way, remember this: the ground doesn't always keep the living out. Sometimes it welcomes us in. There's a grave at Maplewood Cemetery that I can't walk past anymore without feeling the hair rise on the back of my neck. And I'm writing this down because I need someone else to know what happened before I decide whether to quit this job or not. I'm Caleb Foster, 37 years old, and I've been digging graves here for 15 years. In that time, I've developed what my ex-wife used to call an unnerving sensitivity to certain plots. Most grave sites feel neutral, just earth and grass and stone. But some of them feel wrong, like the air pressure changes when you get close, or like something underneath is paying attention. Jesse Brennan's grave was one of those. The court order for the exhumation came through in late September. Jesse had died suddenly back in July, heart attack, according to the initial autopsy, but his sister had been pushing for an independent investigation. She suspected foul play, though she wouldn't say why exactly. At least not to me. I'm just the guy who digs, so I don't usually get involved in the family drama. But the moment I saw Jesse's plot number on the work order, something in my gut twisted. I'd been past that grave a dozen times doing routine maintenance, and every single time I felt like I was interrupting something, like someone was in the middle of a conversation I couldn't hear. What made it worse were the flowers. 3 weeks before the scheduled exhumation date, I started finding fresh orchids on Jesse's grave every morning. Not cheap grocery store flowers. These were expensive, exotic varieties in full bloom, arranged in crystal vases that had to cost more than I made in a day. The thing was, nobody ever saw who left them. Our security cameras covered the main entrance and the access roads, but Oscar Phelps, the night guard, swore he never saw anyone come or go. And yet every morning at dawn, there they were, perfect and pristine, like they'd materialized overnight. Oscar pulled me aside one morning about 2 weeks before the exhumation. We were standing by the maintenance shed, drinking coffee in the early light, and he looked like he hadn't slept. He's 61, been working nights at Maplewood for almost 20 years, and I've never seen him rattled. But that morning his hands shook when he poured his coffee. He told me he'd reviewed the footage from the previous night, specifically the cameras covering Section D, where Jesse was buried. At 2:47 a.m., something had appeared on the monitors, but it wasn't a person. It was distortion, he said, like static interference, moving across the screen in a vaguely human shape. The distortion had moved directly to Jesse's grave, remained there for approximately 11 minutes, and then vanished. When Oscar had driven out to check the site in person, the orchids were there, arranged perfectly on the headstone. I asked him if he'd reported it. He shook his head and said, "Report what, Caleb? That our cameras caught a ghost?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Then he said something that stuck with me. Whatever's leaving those flowers doesn't want to be seen by anything electronic, but it wants us to know it's there. The night before the exhumation, I worked late, preparing the site. Standard procedure: mark the boundaries, clear the surrounding area, position the equipment for the morning crew. It was a Thursday, October 19th, and the sun had set around 6:30. I was working under portable lights, the generator humming steadily, everything normal and routine, except I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Not by Oscar doing his rounds or by anyone visible. It felt like the attention was coming from below, from the grave itself, like something under 6 feet of earth was aware of what I was doing and was waiting. I finished around 8 and packed up the equipment. Before I left, I stood at the foot of Jesse's grave and looked at the orchids someone had left that morning. They were still fresh, pale purple petals almost luminescent in the work lights. I don't know why I spoke out loud. I've never been the type to talk to the dead, but I heard myself say, "Tomorrow we're going to find out what happened to you." The generator chose that moment to sputter and die, plunging everything into darkness. It took me 3 tries to get it started again, and the whole time I stood there in the black, I swear I could feel something shifting in the ground beneath my feet. We started the exhumation at 7 the next morning. My crew, the forensic team, and Detective Amy Gould, who was handling the investigation into Jesse's death. Gould was early 40s, sharp-eyed, the kind of cop who doesn't waste words or time. She watched us work with her arms crossed, asking occasional questions about the process, taking notes. When we'd excavated down to the vault and prepared to open the casket, she moved closer, and I saw her jaw tighten. Whatever she expected to find, she was bracing herself for it. I broke the seal at 9:23 a.m. The casket was a mid-grade bronze model, well sealed, and when I lifted the lid, there was the typical rush of stale air and chemical smell. But what stopped everyone cold wasn't the smell. It was the position of the body. Jesse Brennan had been buried in the standard position on his back, hands folded over his chest, head straight, facing upward. I'd seen the burial photos in the file Detective Gould had brought, but when we opened the casket that morning, Jesse was lying on his right side, facing toward the head of the casket, toward the direction of the cemetery entrance. His left arm was extended, index finger pointing, as if he was indicating something specific, and his eyes were open. I've seen decomposition in all its stages, and I know what happens to a body after 3 months underground. Eyes decompose relatively quickly, especially in an unsealed environment. They should have been gone, or at the very least sunken and collapsed. But Jesse's eyes were intact, desiccated, yes, dried and hollow, but distinctly open and focused in a specific direction. The forensic photographer started snapping pictures immediately, and Detective Gould stepped back from the casket, her face pale. "Bodies don't reposition themselves," she said quietly, and I could hear the control in her voice, like she was trying to convince herself as much as us. The lead forensic examiner, a woman I'd worked with before, just shook her head and said the movement could potentially be explained by decomposition gases, settling, natural processes. But even she didn't sound convinced. I was standing at the foot of the casket, and from that angle I could see clearly where Jesse's finger was pointing. I traced the line across the cemetery, counting plots, and realized he was pointing at Section F, Row 12. I knew every grave in Maplewood, had dug most of them myself, and I knew exactly whose grave was in that location. Sylvia Marsh, dead 2 weeks after Jesse, I dug her grave too. Detective Gould followed my gaze, then pulled out her phone and made a call. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I caught fragments, cross-reference, connection, run everything again. When she hung up, she asked me whose grave Jesse's finger was pointing toward. I told her. Her expression went very still, and she said, "Tell me about Sylvia Marsh." I didn't know much. Woman in her late 30s, sudden death, well-attended funeral. But I remembered the flowers on her grave had been orchids, the same pale purple variety that had been appearing on Jesse's grave every morning for 3 weeks. The investigation moved fast after that. Detective Gould brought in Jesse's widow, Vanessa Brennan, for questioning. Apparently, police had already been looking at her suspicious insurance policy taken out just weeks before Jesse's death, unusual financial transactions, a marriage that friends described as strained, but there hadn't been enough evidence for charges until they started looking into Sylvia Marsh. Gould called me 2 days after the exhumation and asked if I could meet her at the cemetery office. When I arrived, she was sitting with Haley Church, a forensic botanist who'd been brought in to analyze the orchids. Haley was in her early 30s, precise and academic, and she had a file folder full of reports spread across the desk. She explained that the orchids left on Jesse's grave were a specific cultivar, Phalaenopsis memoria rose, that hadn't been commercially available for 7 years. It was a rare variety that had been grown exclusively by a boutique nursery that had gone out of business. She'd tracked down the nursery's old employee records. Sylvia Marsh had worked there as a cultivation specialist until 2018. More digging revealed the rest. Sylvia and Jesse had been having an affair for over a year before his death. Vanessa had found out, confronted Jesse, and shortly after, Jesse had died. Sylvia had died 2 weeks later, officially ruled a suicide, though no note had been found. The orchids appearing on Jesse's grave had been charged to a credit card in Sylvia's name through an automated payment system she'd set up before her death. The card had been canceled by the bank after she died, but the final charge had processed the morning of Jesse's exhumation. Detective Gould asked Vanessa about the orchids during her second interview. According to the recording, Gould later shared with me, Vanessa had gone white. She'd admitted to knowing about the affair, admitted to the insurance policy, but she swore she hadn't killed Jesse. She said he died of natural causes, that she'd just been prepared for it. But when Gould mentioned the flowers, Vanessa had started shaking. She said she'd been receiving anonymous calls in the middle of the night for months. No one on the line, just breathing and the sound of something that might have been wind or might have been whispering. The calls had stopped the day before the exhumation. I went back to Jesse's grave about a week after everything settled. The plot had been refilled, the casket reburied after the autopsy confirmed what we all suspected. Jesse had been poisoned. Vanessa was arrested, charged with murder, though she maintained her innocence. The prosecutor had enough evidence for an indictment, but the case would be complicated. What they couldn't explain, what nobody wanted to talk about, was how Jesse's body had repositioned itself inside a sealed casket, or how his decomposed eyes had remained open and focused, or why he'd been pointing directly at Sylvia's grave. I stood there at the refilled plot and looked across the cemetery towards Section F, Row 12, where Sylvia rested. The distance was maybe 200 feet, clear line of sight if you were standing above ground. I wondered if Jesse had known about Sylvia's death. I wondered if somehow in whatever comes after they'd been aware of each other, calling across the cemetery in ways the living couldn't perceive. The orchids had stopped appearing after the exhumation. Oscar confirmed the static distortions on the security cameras had stopped too. Whatever had been visiting Jesse's grave at night had finished what it came to do. I still work at Maplewood. I still dig graves and perform exhumations and maintain the plots. But I've learned to pay attention when a gravesite feels wrong, when that pressure changes and the air gets heavy. I've learned that the dead aren't always as quiet as we assume. Sometimes they watch. Sometimes they point. Sometimes they leave flowers for each other in the night. Messages we're not meant to understand but can't quite ignore. If you walk through a cemetery and feel that same wrongness, that same weight of attention from below, don't dismiss it. The dead have their own ways of speaking, their own methods of revealing truth. Jesse Brennan lay in the ground for 3 months, slowly turning toward the grave of the woman he'd loved, arranging himself to point the way toward justice. That's not decomposition. That's not natural process. That's something else entirely. And it's something I think about every time I break the seal on a casket. The question that keeps me up at night isn't whether Jesse moved himself or whether Sylvia left those flowers. The question is what they knew that we didn't, what they could see from where they are that we can't see from where we stand, and whether when my time comes and I'm the one in the ground, I'll have that same awareness, that same ability to reach back toward the living and make myself heard. Some graves watch, some graves wait, and some graves do both, patient and focused until someone finally pays attention to what they're trying to say.